Wow, what a day, am I right? So, welcome to Acts. We're going to continue in chapter 9 today. Last week we started in chapter 9 and went through verse 9 of chapter 9. And so today we're going to start in chapter 9, verse 10, and try to, depending on time, only have about an hour today, run to chapter 10, verse 8. We get introduced to some new friends here in this second part of chapter 9. We also get reintroduced to Peter here at the end of chapter 9, and so we get to see him one more time as he's starting to deal with some things related to the differences between Jews and Gentiles, especially those, of course, those who are believers more specifically. But as we have come to that point, if you recall from last time or earlier on in chapter 9, as Saul has had his come to Jesus meeting with Jesus on the road to Damascus, and is now with his entourage in Damascus itself. If you remember, he was blind, not able to eat or not willing to eat or drink for 3 days, and he's waiting to what would happen next. Some people say he's fasting, possibly in preparation. Others would say he's in shock during this time. I don't know. Up to you. I'll let you decide. As also mentioned last week, the Romans allowed the Jewish people a level of authority to do their own things in order to keep riots down, in order to keep other issues down, to keep pretty much the Pax Romana moving forward. And as long as the Romans wouldn't have to jump in and stop a riot or some sort of other social issue, the Jews were, for the most part, on their own to do a lot of what they wanted to do and kind of police their own people. So Saul and the Pharisees, and others within, I guess, the Sanhedrin as well, were really looking to kind of police this situation with the this group called either the Way or the Life, depending on what phase of the church that they're in at this point. And even though Saul and the Pharisees had really no official capacity to arrest anyone or to go find some people, such as in Damascus, and bring them back, they were allowed to do some things. And so the Romans kind of turned a blind eye to this. Even though, as we know later on, when Saul was being persecuted himself as a Roman citizen, he had some protections that it doesn't seem like these people are being offered here at this point. Not saying that they were all Roman citizens, but I imagine there were a decent amount who were. Also remember, the Pharisees were a populist pressure group, so they, like I said, they were no real government officials, and they really had not a lot of power even in the Jewish priestly levels. They were more of a, like I said, a pressure group who were obviously very well educated, had a lot of influence, but not a lot of power, and especially no official government power. Remember last week on Saul's journey encounters Jesus. We'll hear the story retold again, 2 more times. In chapter 22 and in chapter 26, we will see that this happens. And both have some tweaks built in, and there's some interesting pieces to that. And some of these tweaks that we will see have led some people to say, well, is this even a true story? But the thing to always remember in ancient stories such as this, sometimes the authors do tweak things, and they do that for a reason in many ways, and sometimes maybe they're human, so they forget. That could be part of it, but there are some stories that are retold here, and this is one example of them. So 3 times the story is told in Acts. The ones in 22 and 26 are written by Luke, but told by Paul at that time. And we'll see that there's probably only one real contradiction that you could put any sort of weight on, and is the part about the hearing of what the other people who were with Paul or Saul had heard. More specifically, the companions, for the most part, what it was that they heard on that day. So in chapter 9, verse 7, they heard the sound, but did not see anyone, they being the companions. And in chapter 22, verse 9, Paul says that the companions saw the light, but did not understand the voice that was speaking. So maybe they heard something but did not understand the words. 26:14, Paul does not say what the companions saw or heard. So why is that? I imagine Paul's telling a very specific story for a very specific reason, or maybe Luke just left it out because it had already been brought up at one point. I don't think he did it to contradict anything, but that is, some people would say, to do that. So the word that's used in here in Greek is akao, and it is either to mean to hear or to listen. And it is used also in other parts, of course, in the New Testament. You can go and see that. But the voice here is also would be phone. It looks like phone, but phone is a genitive in the first passage and accusative in the second, which thinking of classical Greek, what that really means is that the first version, or the first time we hear it, meant to hear without understanding, and then the second time you hear it is to hear with understanding. So kind of based on how this is all plays out, it's one of those little things that Luke was writing this. He's not contradicting himself. Instead, he just decided maybe to leave it out there in that final version of the story, knowing that the readers who are reading this would get it. They would understand what was going on. The story is still significant. The transformation certainly did happen. Saul certainly did interact with Jesus. Jesus did come to Paul at that point. So always keep that in mind as we go forward here, that sometimes you'll see those sort of contradictions and how all that plays out. All right. So now with all that background here, let's jump into chapter 9, verses 10 through 16 is where we will start. And we get introduced to Ananias here in this latter part, or I guess it's pretty much the middle part of chapter 9, and get to learn a little bit about him and what he's dealing with, and a little bit of history tied to this as well. Now, chapter 9, verse 10, now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and the Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias. And he said, Here I am, Lord. I've heard that before. Go back to the Old Testament. And the Lord said to him, Get up and go to the street called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. And he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. There's a lot about that vision we'll be talking about here in a second. The two visions, the vision of a vision. That's pretty good. It gets a little complicated, doesn't it? But Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he did to your saints at Jerusalem. Here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. But the Lord said to him, Go forward, he has chosen an instrument of mine, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. Okay, it ends there with, obviously if it's in red, Jesus speaking there to Ananias. As you can imagine there in verse 15, to hear to hear that Saul is a chosen instrument of God's, for Ananias to hear this, someone who is very aware of what's going on and are about to happen in Damascus, to hear this must have just been mind-blowing. You can imagine, how do you even compare that to what you would hear today? There's probably, everyone has their own variation of, if they heard something like that, they'd be like, there's no way, and how could this possibly be God talking to me? And that's maybe what Ananias was thinking. So we have the call of Ananias, who's obviously here not super excited about going to meet this murderer / persecutor / mean guy, Saul. But instead, what we'll see, as Saul goes through this 3-day period, he prays and receives a further vision that he'll be met by a man named Ananias. And so that's the vision of the vision that we have here. Ananias has a vision of Saul having a vision. Things sometimes get a little bit complicated, right? So you have this, it's just, that's just the way it happened. I don't know why you can't write this sort of thing, right? Ananias was someone who already lived in Damascus and was not one of the refugees from Jerusalem, so he had already had residence there. It wasn't like he had shown up after the persecution from Jerusalem and then got there. He was already there. And so it seems that the gospel had already reached Damascus in some form or the other. Some would speculate that the good news was brought to Damascus probably earlier on from the people who had been in Galilee. And so that's between Galilee is between, if I remember right, between Jerusalem and Damascus. So they're probably, just bringing that up. And after they got the good news, maybe they were fleeing too, or maybe they just ended up there. If you remember, we talked about earlier on in Acts, when we first started this discussion, we brought up that a lot of the good news, the way it was spread, was through merchants and tradespeople and not necessarily missionaries, just people who had heard the good news as they were doing business in a town or a city and then continued to speak that news wherever their destination was. So, as we know, Ananias does not really want to do this, but of course he's very obedient. So he does, and he does go. And though he was not from Jerusalem, like I had mentioned, he had heard the stuff Saul and other priests were doing to the new faith community, and he really did not want to be a part of it. As you can imagine, I probably wouldn't want to be really a part of it either. And if you're just really honest about that, to really kind of think what's about to happen to me, my family, my livelihood, all that. Not that you wouldn't do it. It's just I don't think anybody would be like, oh yeah, man, yeah, that's great, let's go. In most cases. Anyways, so he goes to the road called Straight, which actually still exists in Damascus. Most likely, it is the house of Judas where they're going. And so it's my understanding is that where this road is on the western end of the road called wherever the house is on the western end of the road called Straight there in Damascus. It has a different name now. I cannot recall what it is at this moment, but anyways, that road still exists. As we look at verse 14, we see those who, at the end of there, to bind all who call on your name. Those who call on your name is a reference back to Joel 2:32. The same thing is said by Peter in his speech during Pentecost in chapter 2, verse 21. Those who called on the name of God were also known as saints, so you can think of it as your saints. As we know, saints is a common designation of believers throughout the New Testament. Even to this day, we refer to fellow believers as saints. Some traditions refer to have different versions or definitions of what a saint is, but we know through a lot of especially through the epistles, that Christians without an office or an official spot or any sort of miracles were referred to as saints. In verses 15 and 16, again, just emphasizes, Ananias did not want to meet Saul, but he does, and he was overruled. So much like how some of our prophets were overruled by God and some of the patriarchs were overruled by God, Ananias is overruled by God as well, because God has a plan, and it is for Ananias and Saul to be a part of it. Ananias is a very, very small part, but very important. Saul's is very important and a very large part. So God had a plan that that neither Ananias nor Saul knew at this point. For the most part, they're both having to start over. Saul's having to start over in his relationship with God, of who God is, his understanding of who God is, which, as you can imagine, with all of his education and everything that he had learned up to that point, and his world experience, worldview, context in which he lived, all of that changed dramatically, and he actually became an enemy of the people that at one point he was the hero of. If you go back and look at how people responded to him with Stephen and the stoning there and everything after that. And then, of course, Ananias has to reset his understanding and relationship with who Saul is. And so all of that is something that had to be reset for both individuals, and both is very significant, hard to do things that would be hard for many of us to do at this point, especially when it comes to our relationship with God. We may be stuck on some sort of idea of who we think God is from the time, when we were a kindergartner, and haven't really evolved or matured from that to have a better understanding of who we are and who God is. And and sometimes it's really hard to make that change or make that to reevaluate our relationship with God. So, of course, we know that Saul was to go to the Gentiles and to be the most influential, and ends up being the most influential evangelist among the Gentile people. But as we will also see, he met with many Jewish people as well, as we will see in verse 20. here in a second. He preached in the synagogues in Damascus, which were most likely Hellenistic synagogues, as well as in the house churches and other public places as well. So he was there preaching. There's some discussion if he preached immediately, if he went away for a while, and then came back and preached. We may touch on that here in a second. But it seems in verse 16, "For I will show you him how much he must suffer for my name's sake," that God assured Ananias that Saul would find his own suffering. And it seemed to be based on the suffering he had caused those who believed in Jesus. So Saul wasn't just going to be all of a sudden the chosen guy. He was going to have to face a lot of stuff and be transformed and redeemed and shaped, which is sometimes painful and sometimes hard. Well, most of the times it is, at least hard to do. We know, and we know this happened because if you go read through the epistles that Paul wrote, his own, very much his own autobiography, in many ways, is he has to endure a lot. There's a lot of suffering for the call that he was on to spread the gospel. So a lot of that is going on through here as well. So as we continue on here in verses 17 through 19, so let's look at those before we transfer to some of what Saul's doing. So verse 17, "So Ananias departed and entered the house, and after laying his hands on him, said, 'Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you were coming, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit.' Immediately there fell from his eyes something like scales, and he regained his sight, and he got up and was baptized, and he took food and was strengthened." So we kind of get the last part of this interaction with Ananias and Saul. This was actually the last time we'll hear of Ananias. He, like I said, he had a very important part, but a very, very small part. Very important, but small. I mean, it's not like he pops back up again and it's like, "Hey, remember me? We're from Damascus. Yeah, I know you're here in Caesarea now, and just thought I'd catch up and see how you're doing. Yeah, things are going great here in the church. Yada, yada, yada." That's all we know of Ananias. And that's how it is with a lot of believers. There's that single influence they may have on you or on others, or that one thing that is significant to your life, but a small role by somebody was played in it. That could be in who and it easily could shape who you become or who you are, and that's similar to what I see with Ananias here. So what we know from Ananias, besides that, he does have the courage and the trust in God to do this as he was asked to do. We also know that he's obedient. So he makes his way to the house where Saul is on the straight road. He fulfills his commission without a lot of fanfare. So it's not like there's people with tambourines and horns following him, leading to this new guy who's going to be helping the Gentiles figure out who God is. It's very low key. He does this through the laying of hands, which is still used today to commission leaders of the church. He also admits him as a brother, as part of the family of Jesus. So to say that we are now brothers. So Ananias now tells Saul, you and I, you brother, I brother, we brothers together in the family of God. And so that's a huge step for Ananias, and probably was quite a spiritual and emotional experience for Saul to hear this, that there is another believer already who's willing to allow him into the family of Jesus, or allow to accept him. The way Saul is used here shows us that it was also said in Aramaic. It's probably repeated, brother Saul or Saul. Yeah, anyways, we've talked about that before sometimes when words are, it's similar to how he was addressed on the road to Damascus, which was in Aramaic as well. Saul will make it clear that the commission did not come from man, which is very true. The commission did not come from Ananias. Ananias is the spokesperson for God. Ananias does put his hands on Saul, but it ultimately had come from Christ, the Son of God. So if we looked at Galatians 1:1 or Galatians 11:20, you'll see how Paul at that point said that's how that worked. It was actually commissioning of Jesus, not the commissioning by Ananias. I guess you could think of this as Ananias is more like what we refer to as the angels, who are the spokespersons or the mouthpieces for God, especially when we see a lot of the Old Testament. When the angel visits the Mary before she has Jesus, or before she is impregnated with Jesus, a spokesperson for God, speaking on behalf, as in they are God. Some in Galatia said that Saul was dependent on the apostles, and the apostles that were still in Jerusalem. That's where he got his ability to do things. That's where he got his power to do things. But Paul makes it again clear in his letter in Galatians that he is called specifically from God to do his work. It's not the apostles. It's not Ananias. It is God who has called him to do his work. And though Ananias spoke the words, it was the power of Christ that opened the eyes of Saul and filled him with the Holy Spirit. This is huge because it shows that it is not an apostolic laying of hands that makes it necessary for someone to be filled with the Spirit. And there was some concern of that earlier on in the church, that the apostles had to be the ones who laid their hands on somebody for the Holy Spirit to enter them. Christ can and will do this on his own, and we see that happens here. This shows us that there's not a specific transmission of apostolic succession or a specific form of ordination required to do the work that Saul is about to do. If Christ did this in such a non-ordinary way of calling Saul to the work of Christ, he can do it again and again and again. It's not like this is a one-time thing. We can all be commissioned and called to do the work of God. Let's continue on. Verses 18 and 19. We're not sure what exactly fell away from Saul's eyes, but he was able to see again after the commissioning. I, for some reason, thought it was cataracts. I'm most likely wrong. Or something that looked like cataracts, but if it scales and they fell, who knows? They don't tell us. There's probably somebody who's done a lot of research on this. I encourage you to look that up. It's neither here nor there. I imagine there's people who arm wrestle about it, but there's no reason to. At this point, there's the eating of food that we see that Saul does to improve his physical power to go along with his new given to him by God spiritual power. All right. Let's wrap this section up. And so let's read the second half of verse 19, and we'll go through verse 22 about Saul beginning to preach the word of Christ. Like I said, we'll never hear from Ananias again. He had his 15 minutes of fame. He came to do the work that God had wanted him to do here on earth. And it's not to say that he did not go on and continue to preach or teach or to share the good news and to help people and to love people. We just don't know. Most likely, based on just evidence of how he treated Saul, he probably continued to have his own ministry in some capacity along the way. We know that he was an obedient believer and was able to obey in a way that would, to most of us, seem crazy and life-threatening. And, well, of course, then dangerous. So verses 19 through 22, Saul goes out and begins preaching in Damascus, most likely again in the synagogues of the people he was on his way to persecute. So here it is. Now for several days he was with the disciples who were at Damascus, and immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, "He is the Son of God." Jesus is the Son of God. All those hearing him continued to be amazed, and were saying, "Is this not he who in Jerusalem destroyed those who called on the name, and who had come here for the purpose of bringing them bound before the chief priests?" Such a deep question to ask. We just think about it. Could you imagine you're sitting there and someone would just ask it, do they proclaim it loudly so everyone hears? It's very interesting. But Saul kept increasing in strength and confounding the Jews who lived at Damascus by proving that this Jesus is the Christ. Confounding the Jews. That's a great word, isn't it? Confounding. I hate when I'm confounded. It's the worst kind of confusion or misunderstanding or understanding. Let's see here. Oh, this is even better. Consternation. I like it. To cause consternation. Sancheo in Greek, if I remember right. Wow. Yes. Okay. So he goes out. This is a crazy change of events, as you can imagine, for our Jewish friends there in Damascus. They knew Saul was coming to arrest those who were following the way. Instead, he preaches the same message that the new believers were teaching. The very people that he was persecuting, he is now teaching the exact same message they were giving, which seems, of course, a bit odd, what Luke is saying about Saul here based on what we know about Saul's autobiography in Galatians 1:15 through 17. So, this is where it gets a little bit odd, right? So if you go to Galatians 1:15 through 17, I encourage you to do that if you haven't already jumped there. And we look at that. But when God, and this is Galatians 1:15 through 17, but when God, who had set me apart even from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. Dun dun dun. So you wonder what exactly, so he says this here, but it says here, he was with the disciples and immediately began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogues. But yet here, he says he doesn't do that. He goes away for a while. Is someone lying? I would say no. I would say that what we know is that he did go to Arabia. We'll hit about that. Oh, actually, we'll talk about that right now. Saying that he did not confer with any human after he received the revelation from Christ. Okay, let's go to the Galatian way first. So he goes to Arabia, the Nabatean kingdom, which was on the eastern frontier of Syria, is where he ends up, and pretty much stretched out to the Red Sea. So he possibly spent a very short time in Damascus, speaking in the synagogues before going to Arabia, or possibly without delay after returning from Arabia, spoke in the synagogue. So he had been to Arabia for a while, collected himself, and then has now returned into Damascus to speak in the synagogues there. Here or there, it's just very interesting, right? Just to see it again. It doesn't. It's a contradiction. There's lies. I don't see it that way. I see it as more of Luke is telling us a story about what happened after Saul was converted, and Paul in Galatia is now providing his take on it. And so some would say that, and immediately he began. So verse 20 would be, once he returned to Damascus, he immediately began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying he is the Son of God. And the people would still be amazed. It's not like just because he disappears for a while. Some people, I believe, say 3 years, but just because he disappeared for a while doesn't mean that when he shows back up, people forgot what he used to do, because it was pretty well known and pretty bad. So people would still be amazed if that indeed, in fact, happened that way. I imagine you could go look at multiple other commentaries and look at this, and there would be different takes of how this all played out. But that's the one that I saw. So, well, that's the one I'm going to go with, at least at this point. And, someday, 5 years from now, when I read this again, well, I'm going to read it before then, but if I ever teach it again or study it deeply like this again, to get more of the background, I'll probably, who knows, maybe some way or some other way we'll see a different view of how this happened. So anyways, verse 20, the idea of the Son of God. This is the only time Son of God is mentioned in Acts. Remember, it was the Son of God that Christ revealed to him on the road to Damascus. The Son of God title points to the Messiah. It is used and a lot of times, of course, when it's used in the Old Testament, well, all the time when it's used in the Old Testament, but anyways, in one case, the anointed king of Israel as the Son of God, pointing to the ideal king of the future, the Messiah of David's line. So if you look at that and you read some of that, and sometimes it's a little confusing because you see people referred to as the Son of God, it's all pointing forward to the lineage, the line, to who Jesus is as the Son of God. The contemporaries of Jesus thought that he was or could be the Son of God when he is referenced in Mark 26:63 as the Son of the Blessed One. They don't want to admit or use the name of God here, so you'll notice that there are parts in the New Testament where the Pharisees or Sadducees are talking and they will not say the word God. They will say something like the Blessed One or something related to that because they were afraid to say that. So as the Son of God, or the Messiah, he is marked as a true representative of the God of Israel. It is more than a title, as we know from Jesus' baptism, where God refers to him as his Son. So if you looked at that in Mark 1:11. So we get three aspects here of the sonship of Jesus to God. There's perfect obedience to God, ultimate revealer of who God is. That is not saying that he's going to reveal everything of who God is and what God is, but he's going to be the only one who can really reveal who God is through, of course, the power of the Holy Spirit. And then authorized agent of God. Ultimately, we know, and Acts has been showing us, Jesus, the Son of God, is the Messiah. So all of that is kind of coming into play here and pointing forward there in verse 20. Verses 21 and 22. He shows up at the synagogue as he has told the high priest in Jerusalem that it is what he has to do, but he does not arrest the disciples of Jesus, but instead he brings different news as a messenger of Jesus. So he does do what he tells the priest he's going to do. He does go to the synagogues, but instead of arresting people, he tells them about Jesus. The people were amazed by this huge transition of who Saul is as he enters the synagogues, and I imagine they were not. At first, they were probably a little hesitant to come too close to him, thinking maybe this is some sort of ruse. And that could have been what Ananias was thinking as well, is, okay, we'll let this guy into our secret club, but then he turns on us. So we probably watched plenty of dramas where that's played out. So anyways, now at this point, Saul has the power of the Holy Spirit. So the words that he spoke about the Messiah, Jesus, were to be believed. There were some level of demonstrative power that he had, much like Stephen, which helped people to believe. You'd have to say that was most likely, very possibly, positively true, because there is a lot of skepticism, you could assume, with Saul showing up now and doing the work that he was doing. And so he probably had to show something beyond just his words for people to better understand exactly that he had turned and he had become a follower of Jesus. All right, let's read the rest of, we'll just call this section before we get reintroduced to Peter there in verse 32. So chapter 9, verses 23 through 31. This is very interesting about what's about to happen, because there's some upset people now. Can you imagine? There's some people who are like, woohoo, Saul's turned, super excited, miracle of Jesus, doing his work. Oh, even the worst can be redeemed. But there are some people who are pretty ticked, and that's what we're about to see right now. So when many days had elapsed, the Jews plotted together to do away with him. But their plot became known to Saul. They were also watching the gates day and night so they might put him to death. Those guys turn in a heartbeat. It's crazy how quickly these Jewish friends turn. It's just nuts. Actually, it probably took a little bit more, but just because we're reading it this way, it seems like it was immediate. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a large basket. When he came to Jerusalem, he was trying to associate with the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took hold of him and brought him to the apostles and described to them how he had seen the Lord on the road and that he had talked to him, and how at Damascus he had spoken out boldly in the name of Jesus. And he was with them, moving about freely in Jerusalem, speaking out boldly in the name of the Lord. And he was talking and arguing with the Hellenistic Jews, but they were attempting to put him to death. But when the brethren learned of it, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him away to Tarsus. So the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria enjoyed peace, being built up and going on in the fear of the Lord and the comfort of the Holy Spirit. It continued to increase. What a beautiful story. Look at verse 31. It's just amazing. Woohoo. It's exciting. Okay. Because there were these good times. There were the good times of the church. There's also a lot of persecution of the church, which happens and continues to happen to this very day. All right. So, and then as I get slightly distracted here and shift to something very quickly, just to make sure we're all on the same page. All right. Saul takes Saul takes off from Damascus. As it seems, he was no longer welcomed by the more traditional Jewish folks. It gets a little bit deeper than that. We're going to talk about that here in a second. We need to reference 2 Corinthians 11:23 through 33 to get the full picture of what's going on here. The ethnarch king, I'm not saying that exactly right, Aretas, was guarding the city of Damascus to seize Saul. But Saul's helpers helped him escape. So let's turn there real quick. 2 Corinthians. Romans always get in the way. All right, 2 Corinthians 11:23 through 33. Oops, went too far. So he's going over, if you remember that, he's going over all the trouble and hardship he's been in. There it is, specifically in verse 32. I knew in Damascus the ethnarch under Aretas, the king was guarding the city of the Damascenes in order to seize me, and I was let down in Damascus. So he's kind of repeating what happened there. So this again is good confirmation historically of this happening. So Aretas the fourth was ruler of the Nabatean kingdom from 9 BC to 40 AD. So, very possible that Saul was in there. The very kingdom in Arabia where Saul had gone to get some respite. It seems based on the king's response and what we're seeing here that he got a little bit more than just a little bit of R&R. Those of you, it's rest and relaxation, and other things happen. It seems like Saul had probably gone to Mount Horeb as Moses and Elijah had done. He went there immediately after his commission to proclaim Christ to the Gentiles, as well as to contemplate his new life. Based on the response of the Nabatean leaders, he annoyed some folks in Arabia. We're not sure exactly what it is. I think if we probably dug a little bit deeper into the history of that time, we'd probably see that. But anyway, the ethnarch in Damascus looked after the Nabatean subject who lived there as was King Aretas's representative in Damascus. So Damascus was under I can think of it, I guess, as a diplomat. Probably a little bit more than that. But anyways, the Jews' role here seems that they wanted Saul out as well, so they told the ethnarch of Saul's whereabouts. And so the Jews are now conspiring again with the Gentiles, much like they did with Jesus when the Jews conspire with the Romans. So we have that. And so they hopefully maybe they could arrest him and send him back to Arabia to pay the dues for whatever he did when he was there. So while they were at the gates waiting for Saul to show up and to try to sneak out, some of Saul's new friends busted open a hole in the wall, or possibly just had a window that was available, and lowered him through the city's wall and lowered him down, and then Saul hightails it to Jerusalem. So there's a little bit more deeper to that maybe there were some conspiracies, or maybe he had caused some issues in the foreign land in which he went, and those people were now coming to look for him. Just an interesting backstory. Either way, if it was just the Jewish people who were upset with him, obviously they were upset with him because he had come to do one thing and did something completely different, and he pretty much left everything that he had believed in the past. He threw that away. He pushed all of his other buddies aside, all the other people that either liked him, relied on him, or thought him to be someone who was a true Jew. He has now highly offended them, and so of course they're upset with him. All right, verses 26 through 30. Saul is in Jerusalem, and they get shipped off to Tarsus, where of course he is from. The people in Jerusalem were not really happy with him being there to see Saul at all based on his activities, but fortunately we have the encourager, Barnabas, who takes him under his wing and helps him out. And we see that starting to happen here. So Saul, at this point in verse 26, has two things going against him. Thing one is his old associates knew that he had defected, so they were not overly happy to have him there or to help him in any way. So he maybe he went to them to kind of spread the good news, and they were like, yeah, we're kind of done with you. And if you need any help in any way, don't come knocking on our door. And then the other thing he had against him, so thing two, was that those who had become followers of the way could not believe he had changed sides. Again, thinking maybe like Ananias could have, or those in Damascus synagogues thought it could be a scheme for him to get inside their group. Of course, this has happened before. They knew it could happen again, and so they were very leery of this guy. So fortunately, Barnabas lives up to his name, and he encourages the people to take Saul in. There in verse 27. Some believe that, well, it seems, based on our stories here, that Barnabas and Saul had known each other before Saul had entered into Jerusalem. Based on this, Barnabas had already known that Saul had been transformed. I guess you can see that there, where he had talked to him and how at Damascus he had spoken out boldly in the name of Jesus. So it's something that there's already that relationship. Why Barnabas is now back in Jerusalem. He probably was done with whatever he was doing in Damascus and went back. Or maybe he follows Saul back. Doesn't really say. But anyways, Barnabas is there, and he kind of helps Saul get introduced. Fortunately, the people highly regarded Barnabas, so they took his word that Saul was legitimate and wasn't there to conspire against them or destroy them, and so that is good news. We know from Galatians chapter 1, 18 through 20, that the only apostles that Saul met on that day was James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter. It was possible maybe the others were out doing other things or out of town or killed. Maybe not killed at that point. It's maybe a little early for that. But they were not available. Again, just a little side note, historical fact. Or fact based on what we understand here to be. The people had learned that their former prosecutor is now preaching the truth in the synagogues and at home churches. So, and Paul makes it clear in Galatians 1 that it is the authority of Jesus who gave him the right to teach in Jerusalem. It was not the authority of the apostles or the authority of any one human. It was fully the authority of Jesus. He spends, it seems, a lot of time with the Hellenists and the Gentiles when he is in Jerusalem. Then again, that's why he is now doing what he's doing, because that's what God wanted him to do. We need to remember that he only went to Jerusalem for a short time. He had already been teaching in Damascus and other parts of the region. And so while he was there in Jerusalem, he spoke to the same people who Stephen spoke to, the same people who stoned Stephen. They did not like Saul any better, so they were going to take Saul out as well. So you have to think that obviously Jerusalem probably had not changed much. I mean, as long as those same high priests and priestly leaders were in charge, they probably were continuing to persecute. And when this guy shows up, this turncoat comes back to Jerusalem, they were probably wanting to do to him what they did to Stephen. Fortunately, Saul and others learn about this. So for the most part, Saul's friends, or new friends, see that it will not end well for Saul, so they send him back to Tarsus. As we know, that is the land from which he is from. He spent some time in Syria and Cilicia, which was a united imperial province of Rome at that time, but yet kept its autonomy. I know you wanted to know that. Tarsus at this point was about 1,000 years old, so it was already an ancient city by this point, and was the main city in the region of Cilicia. Tarsus was a city of well-educated people there, with plenty of schools devoted to philosophy, rhetoric, and law. It did not have the same status as, say, Alexandria or Athens, but it was a very well-known, well-educated society, which makes sense. That's where our friend Saul came from. We lose track of Saul at this time because we get to start learning more about Peter. We won't see him again until chapter 11, verse 25. But apparently, while he was gone, or while we are away, he was doing quite a bit evangelizing. Knowing his trip from Caesarea to Tarsus was setting the pattern of future sea voyages that we will learn about through his multiple voyages that we hear the stories of in his epistles. So it's going to, we have, as we know, that makes up a lot of his evangelizing career. So, anyways, verse 31. this great growth. We enter a time of peace and prosperity for the church. In many regions surrounding Jerusalem, there's peace and growth in the church. The original Jerusalem church is the church referred to here, which has now dispersed and decentralized throughout the region. So it started in Jerusalem. The church in Jerusalem is now dispersed. So we're looking at not only just inside Jerusalem, but how Jerusalem's church is now spread throughout the region. So what is still for the most part a Jewish, semi-Jewish church is still on ancient Jewish soil throughout the region, but it is no longer in the city of Jerusalem. So it's starting to spread. It's starting to do what Jesus had called it to do earlier in Acts, at the very, very first chapter of Acts. All right, now we got to learn about Peter. And so the last part of chapter 9 is with our friend Peter. And he is very busy, as we see here. He takes on one more appearance there in western Judea. And he's taking the gospel to the coastal plains of Judea based on what we see here. Okay, so I'm just going to read the rest of this chapter because it's just one really good story. Okay, now as Peter was traveling through all those regions, he came down also to the saints who lived at Lydda. Again, saints being believers. There he found a man named Aeneas and had been bedridden 8 years, and for he was paralyzed. Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and make your bed. Immediately he got up, and all who lived at Lydda and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord. Now in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which is translated in Greek as called Dorcas. That was the worst, but I guess that's the way it works. This woman was abounding with deeds of kindness and charity, which she continually did. And it happened at that time that she fell sick and died. And when they had washed her body, they laid it in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, having heard that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, imploring him, do not delay in coming to us. So Peter arose and went with them. When he arrived, they brought him into the upper room, and all the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing all the tunics and garments that Dorcas used to make while she was still with them, But Peter sent them all out, knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise! And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up, and calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. It became known all over Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And Peter stayed many days in Joppa with a tanner named Simon. That's funny, right? His name's Simon Peter. He kind of has a friend named Simon. Simon deals with dead animals, which, Jews love. I just think it's very interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about that here. So we have the healing of Aeneas here from Peter earlier on. We have not seen Peter since chapter 8, verse 25, when he had returned with John to Jerusalem from Samaria after checking on the folks in Samaria. Peter finds himself in Lydda, which is Greek for Lod. The people there were most likely the victims of the persecution of Jerusalem. The people that he was dealing with were people who had probably been chased and ran away from Jerusalem. Peter at this point is kind of in is itinerant the right word? It could be. Traveling ministry, where he's going from town to town, finding those who had dispersed and are teaching them and encouraging them and helping them grow in their faith. I imagine there's a lot of healing along the way as well, so he kind of got a name for himself. Philip had stopped here on his way to Caesarea from Azotus. If you go back to 8:40, chapter 8, verse 40, we see that. Lydda was known as a major administrative district of Judea, so decent size little town. Verses 33 through 34, he finds this this man Aeneas who is injured, and we can assume the man that Peter healed of 8 years of paralysis was part of the way. He was probably one of the believers, but we are not told that is to be true. We just know that he'd been bedridden and paralyzed for 8 years. We just can make that assumption based on why Peter was there and the people that he was visiting at the time. When you see the get up or make your bed, where is it? Make your bed. There in verse 34. When we see that, it could be a play on words that Peter is doing here. Instead of just getting up, making your bed, it was more like get up and set a table for yourself so that you can eat. there may be more to that. And why would he say that? Because it seems that it was typical to have nourishment here in Acts, and other New Testament writers have said the same thing. After being healed, a provision of nourishment. So it could be, so Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and set your table, as in nourish yourselves, because you are now full, you're healed, so now nourish your body based on that. Or it could have been, get up, make your bed, or roll it up and put it away, and the purpose you're using it for will no longer be needed. So weigh it as you will. It's just that's kind of fun things that happen sometimes whenever you're 2,000 years away from an ancient text that no one really writes anymore, or speaks at least. I guess we do write it. I just did that in seminary. So I guess it's still written. Well, not officially. Students it is. So this verse 35, this area was a semi-Gentile region. So all the people who showed up after this healing saw what had happened to this man, and the good news continues to spread. So it's not just Jewish people who saw this, or Jewish people who had become believers, but all people, Gentiles as well. So now we get to meet our friend Tabitha, or Dorcas, and so where Peter is able to spend some time in Joppa. The town of Joppa is on the Mediterranean coast, about 10 to 11 miles northwest of Lydda. We read about it in the Old Testament. It has come up in Egyptian records around 15th BC. It is within the area now what we would know as Tel Aviv. As in Lydda, where Peter is currently spending his time, he goes to Joppa at the behest of some disciples who lived in Joppa. The woman Tabitha, or Dorcas, which in Aramaic means gazelle, so maybe she knitted very quickly, or had swift feet. In Hebrew, her name would be Zibia. I would prefer Zibia over Dorcas, but that's just because we're 2,000 years and Dork is not a fun word to say to somebody, but back then it had not even close, that word didn't exist. So anyways, we get that. So if you wanted to go back and look at 2 Kings 12:1, you'll see that name there. She was known well known there in the community for her Christian charity, her making of garments, helping people, and helping those in her community, serving her community. Knowing most likely that Peter had healed Aeneas, they sent for him to see if he could help Tabitha as well, and if he had the power of Jesus, which in the healing way it seemed like he did. Through the power of Jesus, they probably have heard of some of Jesus' healings, some of Peter's healings, some of the other apostles' healings, and knew that, hey, let's give this a shot. So as we look into verse 39, so Jesus is not here at the moment. So Peter rises, and he goes with what we understand to be two messengers. It was brought into the room where Tabitha's body lay, and she had been washed as Jewish custom would be for the purification of the body. So she did her. They had formally prepared her for the funeral. And the women, which we seem to see are mainly widows, it shows Peter the gifts that Dorcas had given them and the work she had done in their community. Most likely they had these clothes, these tunics and garments on, and were just showing them to Peter. I doubt it was like a fashion show. As more of, well, you can imagine widows showing garments or clothes that they had on. So anyways, 40 through 42, Peter follows Jesus' role here as Jesus did with Jairus' daughter. When she was in her deathbed, he sends everyone out of the room. He utters something in Aramaic, much like Jesus did. He says, for the most part, the same thing as Jesus with a single change in the letter, but it does not seem to change the meaning. Instead of Talith Kumi, he does Talitha Kumi. I know, right? It's that close. She gets up, and Peter presents her to her wandering friends, as Peter should do. And many at that point decide to follow Jesus once they see this power so marvelous and wonderful that allowed the restoration to Tabitha to happen. So is a big day for Tabitha, as you can imagine, big day for that community, and probably. And a good day for Peter, but he probably wasn't as pumped up about it just because, he'd done it before, or had seen it before. So, anyways, okay. So, verse 43. Simon becomes a friend of Peter's, as we know here. Simon the tanner becomes a friend of Peter. he is a tanner who most likely lived on the seaside of the city, and because typically tanners would use the water from the sea for their trade, for the tanning of the hides, he probably lived outside of town. The reason that is because it was a unclean business that he ran, as in you're touching dead animals, so they're unclean, and the Jews can't be with that. So it's just very interesting that what Peter's doing. He is hanging out with this man who works on unclean animal hides. You'd have to think that what Peter's doing here is helping him kind of move along with the vision he's about to have, that God's about to give him about unclean foods. Take that as you will. Coincidence? Probably not, but it is a preparation for Peter to be more used to being around unclean foods and be able to eat foods that Gentiles will eat. And it's just interesting to see the kind of detail that Luke provides when he writes about people like Simon and where Peter stayed and that sort of thing. So, anyways, that's where we are at the end of chapter 9. Wow, what a journey! Am I right? So we're going to while we're here, let's talk about Cornelius. So we'll continue to talk about Peter, but we get introduced to a new friend. So many new friends today. We started out with Ananias, and then we get Barnabas, and then we get Aeneas, and then we get Tabitha and all her friends, and now we get Cornelius. Okay, let me read chapter 10, 1 through 8. Now there was a man at Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian cohort, a devout man, and one who feared God with all his household, and gave many alms to the Jewish people, and prayed to God continually. About the 9th hour of the day, he clearly saw in a vision an angel of God who had just come in, and said to him, Cornelius! And fixing his gaze on him, and being much alarmed, he said, What is it, Lord? And he said to him, Your prayers and alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now dispatch some men to Joppa, and send for a man named Simon, who is also called Peter. Isn't that funny? I mean, why don't you just say Peter? Because Peter's living with Simon. And that's so confusing. But anyways, it's just interesting. And he is saying, Peter named Simon, whose house is by the sea. When the angel who was speaking to him had left, he summoned 2 of his servants and a devout soldier of those who were his personal attendants, and after he had explained everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. So Cornelius, the centurion, sees a vision. We take another trip back to Caesarea. We've been there before. We'll be there again. And the good news has crossed another barrier, not only to a Gentile, but to an official and a centurion of the Roman army, someone who would be relatively powerful with a lot of influence and could kill a lot of people. So this is a big deal, but he also happens to be someone who is a God-fearer. We'll talk about that more here in a second. So he was Cornelius was stationed in an auxiliary cohort in Judea, the region of Judea, which is about 500 fighting men, or the 10th of a legion. Funny story, there is no record of legionary troops in Judea between 6 AD and 66 AD, which is the time period we're in. So this is more of an auxiliary cohort, Italian, which has about 1,000 men. So it's a little bit different. So it was Italian because it started in Italy, but at this time it'd be eventually made up of the people in the province, so the area of Judea. So there's probably not a lot of Italians in this Italian cohort anymore, depending on how long it was there, but it originally started in Italian. The reason that these people in this region would want to jump on board and be part of this Italian cohort is because once you signed on and served your duty unless you got killed, but once your duty expired, you automatically received Roman citizenship. So kind of a big deal. So Cornelius, as a centurion, was a non-commissioned officer. He probably had about 100 men based on century, 100. In today's army vernacular, though Cornelius was not commissioned, he'd be probably at the same level of responsibility as what we know today as an army captain. So, of course, we know are commissioned, if I remember my officers right. So, a little bit different. But centurions were backbones of the Roman army. It is our understanding that Jesus' first encounter with the Gentile in public ministry was a centurion in Capernaum. If you go back to Matthew chapter 8, verse 11, where it is predicted from this point forward that people will come from east and west to sit at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're now seeing these words come to light via another centurion. So it's amazing how God works with people who you'd never expect to get to know who God is. Though he has not had his vision yet, Peter and Cornelius come to a similar preparedness through visions. We will see Peter's in verse 9. So we are not going to get there today, but Peter will have a vision as well. We've had a lot of visions today too, haven't we? Both are showing how Peter is able to open the kingdom of heaven to Gentiles, to allow Jews and Gentiles to come to the same table without having to have Jewish customs fulfilled, such as circumcision or eating unclean foods and stuff like that. There will be a lot more debate about this at the Council of Jerusalem there in chapter 15. So anyways, a little bit of background, but let's finish up here with Cornelius, who is a devout man there in verse 2. He referred to what we would sometimes call a God-fearer. He's a Gentile who is a worshiper of the God of Israel. So he could not be a Jew because he was not circumcised, and there's probably other reasons too, based on his past lifestyle. But that'd be one reason. Anyway, so he was a Gentile who worshipped the God of Israel. There are many others along the way, but this is just one example. In this time, there were many who were willing and wanting to follow the Jewish God, but they were not willing to go all in. Again, you're an adult male, circumcision, not happy or too pumped about that. I'm gonna believe in this God, but I'm just not. I can't do that. And so that's kind of where we were with these people. I think the idea was that they were attracted to this monotheistic, the monotheistic viewpoints of the Jewish worship and the ethical standards of the Jewish way of life, and it was a whole lot less chaotic than the more pagan, multi-deity, polytheistic lifestyle, which was nutso. And so they were probably attracted to this more calm, caring, loving way of life, monotheistic way of life. Many of these people who were God-fearers would follow the same traditions as the Jewish people in regards to their prayer life, like Cornelius in synagogue participation, which we see here, Sabbath, abstaining from certain foods. For the most part, had every qualification besides, like what I mentioned before, they want to get circumcised or did not get circumcised. The Roman army itself had its own religious observances, most of which were like what we'd refer to as we could call like a modern church parade, but it had very little spiritual depth. And so I imagine it seems like our friend Cornelius here was looking for a little bit more spiritual depth. So those who wanted more looked to Judaism. We'll find that these Gentile God-fearers formed the nucleus of the early church. Again, these are people who believed in the God of Israel and had now become followers of the Messiah, much like our eunuch friend from Ethiopia did just two chapters ago, back there in chapter 8. Many believe that Luke was one of these God-fearing Gentiles who came to faith when he himself heard the good news. So sometimes it's mistaken that Luke is Jewish, but he was actually a Gentile God-fearer. Verses 3 through 6, Cornelius is at his typical time of prayer. Like I said, like other God-fearers, he would follow the synagogue prayer calendar, and he is visited by an angel, or at least one that appears to him in a vision. He quickly learns that God has noticed his faithful prayers and almsgiving. God finds that he is giving to be worth. This seems and sounds very Levitical in the language here. Your prayers and alms will you give to the poor have ascended. Just think about this: ascended like a smoke, like incense, like a fine perfume, like the sense when animals were burned on the altar or sacrificed on the altar, the scent that would go up into heaven. So ascended as a memorial for God. So you're getting a lot of Levitical viewpoints here in verse 4, a lot of sacrificial language, this idea of piety and charity, of who Cornelius is, which the Jewish people were to be like this, but were not acting in this way. So you can think about this again like the incense, sacrifice of the smoke of the sacrifice, all that. Much like God had regarded others, such offerings with a suitable response, he would do the same here, and of course then would bless Cornelius based on this. He would know that the response once he sends for Peter at the house of Simon, he would know that once Peter comes to him and they have their conversation. So that's going to come more to this, more understanding for Cornelius as we continue into chapter 10. So in 7 and 8, Cornelius does what he is called to do or asked to do, sends a couple of his house servants and a God fearing soldier are dispatched to Joppa to get Peter to come and visit him in Caesarea. And that's where we will end today because that's all the time we have. It's one of those things where, you just hope you always have more time than you actually do and you don't. So, anyways, we'll start there next week, chapter 10, verse 9, wrap up chapter 10. And we'll see if we get into chapter 11. Very possible. Very possible, but I don't know. Anyways, I hope your day is fantastic. Thank you.